Hello, this is a data overview of Chapel Hill Middle School CRCT scores over the last 3 years. We're going to jump right in and start looking at the data that we have. The purpose of the data overview is to present a clear summary of the student achievement data at Chapel Hill Middle School for the staff at Chapel Hill Middle School as well as the staff at Chapel Hill High School. This presentation is going to look at demographic information, CRCT scores from 2012 through 2014, strengths and weaknesses that we might find, and then questions for us to think about. We can first quickly look at our student enrollment. Our student enrollment has remained fairly constant between about 1,165 and 1,174 students. So we've stayed pretty close in that range. The chart makes it look like it's a bigger jump than it actually is, but it's still relatively close. When we look at the student demographic data for Georgia, when we look at high school students, you can see that there are a total of over 752,000 students in the state of Georgia. You can see that the white demographic is the largest, but not by much. It's at 42%, and then your black demographic will be at 38%. When we compare this to Douglas County schools, we can see that there's a little bit of a difference. The white population in the Douglas County school system is only 30%, and the black population is at 51%, so it's quite a bit higher than Georgia's overall population. Now, when we look at Chapel Hill Middle School, you can see that this percentage is even greater. The percentage of white students at Chapel Hill Middle are at 27%, and the percent of black students enrolled are at 59%, almost 60%. You can see that the other demographics are fairly close to the county and state averages. When we look at our student subpopulations at Chapel Hill Middle, you can see that there is a very small ELL population that has limited English proficiency. About 7% of the population is students with disabilities. We have no migrant students, but you can see the students that are considered low SES status, we are staying right around 45%, so it's relatively high. I have two charts here to look at the difference in gender at Chapel High School, the difference between males and females. When we look at the chart on the left at the bar graph, you can see that in the blue, the males over the last 3 years have steadily rose, while the female population has steadily gone down. Now, this is much more evident when we look at the chart on the right at the line graph, and you can see that the males are trending up and the females are definitely trending down. If this continues, it'll be interesting to see if it has an effect on the school dynamics and scores on the CRCT. Now, our general observations from the demographic data, we can see that the total enrollment at Chapel Hill Middle has remained fairly constant over this 3-year period. When we compare the demographics, the district and Chapel Hill Middle are more diverse than the state populations are. Over the last 3 years, the racial and ethnic diversity at Chapel Hill Middle have remained constant with less than a 1% change within any group. And then also over the last 3 years, the male student population has steadily increased while the female population has steadily decreased. Now we can look at the state, district, and school CRCT performance by content area for middle school students, which are 6th through 8th grade, for the 2013-2014 school year. If you look at the chart, you'll see that all of the content areas are listed, and you can see the percentage of students that are at or above proficiency. Georgia schools are going to be in green, Douglas County schools are in red, and then Chapel Hill Middle School is going to be in blue. And it's nice to say that Chapel Hill Middle is exceeding the district and state levels in all the categories, and it is far ahead of both in social studies and science. This is another comparison of student achievement of the CRCT scores for students that meet and exceed proficiency for 6th through 8th grades. And this just gives you two charts that will show you the differences between Chapel Hill Middle and Douglas County schools. We've already seen this on the other chart, but it didn't have all 3 years in there. And you can tell by looking at the charts that Chapel Hill Middle School is above Douglas County in all of the areas, especially in science and social studies. And now we can look at Chapel Hill Middle School compared to Georgia for students that meet and exceed in their CRCT scores. From these two charts, you can see that Chapel Hill Middle School is also performing higher than your students in Georgia overall. Now we're going to look at student achievement data for Chapel Hill Middle School specifically for 2011 through 2014. And this chart shows the percentage of students who meet or exceed standards on the CRCT. So this is strictly Chapel Hill Middle, and you can see the content areas and where Chapel Hill has changed over the 3 years. Now you can see that the chart shows that in all categories, Chapel Hill is performing above 80% proficiency of students that meet and exceed the standard. And in most of the categories, we are above 90%. So I think this is something that's really good. Observations. Over the last 3 years, Chapel Hill Middle has outperformed state and district students in all areas of the CRCT. So this is something that we should be very proud of. The percentage of Chapel Hill Middle School students that meet or exceed proficiency in social studies have increased each year. So I think this is something that's positive. It's gone from our lowest category and has moved up to students performing above 90%. The science CRCT scores at Chapel Hill Middle School decreased from the 2012-13 school year to the 2013-14 school year. So this is something that we definitely need to be aware of. Let's look at one of our strengths. So our student achievement in reading is very, very good. We can see comparison from Chapel Hill Middle School, Douglas County schools, and Georgia students. Our percentage that met or exceeded the reading proficiency has stayed right around 99%. Which is really good. When we look at the Douglas County school system overall and Georgia schools, you can see that this is an area that most students do well in, with all the groups staying above 95%. When we go back to our chart that shows Chapel Hill's student achievement, we see that social studies is also an area that we should, really look at, because if we look at the past 3 years, each year, this is the only subject that we have improved on. We've gone from 86.3% to 90.60 to 91%. So we have gradually been increasing over the past 3 years in social studies. This shows good continued growth. So I think this is something that we should be proud of and something that we should continue, and maybe find out what we're doing in those class settings to possibly take some of those practices and include them in other areas. Okay, our strengths. Overall, Chapel Hill Middle School has performed solidly in all the content areas. Compared to many other schools, we're doing very well. Our reading scores on the CRCT have remained extremely high, staying at or above 99% that meet or exceed the standard, which is great. And our social studies scores on the CRCT have increased over the last 3 years, surpassing science and reaching 91% that meet or exceed proficiency. So I think this is something that is very strong for us. Now, when we look back at all of the content areas, we see probably the area that we should look or be most concerned with would be science. It is our current lowest performing area out of all the subjects. So when we look at our science achievement on the CRCT for 6th through 8th grades, and we compare that to Douglas County and Georgia overall, we can see that Chapel Hill is outperforming Douglas County and the state by quite a bit, but we've moved forward 1 year and then we have dropped back below where we were. We were at 89%, we went up to 90.7, and then we dropped back down to 88.8. So we're staying kind of in that stagnant high 80s to 90s range, which is still a great position to be in. But when we look at all of our content areas overall, this is the area that we might want to emphasize to try to improve our scores on, because this is our lowest area of performance. When we look at our science scores, we can look at many of the subgroups and demographics within our classes at Chapel Hill Middle to see how each group and subgroup are performing. When we look at each year, we can see that students overall are meeting or exceeding the standard right at or above 90% of the students, which is great. When we look at our breakdown by demographics, we can see that our lowest area is going to be our black students. Another area that we can look at and see some kind of negative change would be our Hispanic students that have slightly gone down each year. When we look at some of our subgroups, we can see that our students with disabilities are definitely our lowest performing group. And this is something that we really might want to focus on. So when we look at our different ethnic groups that meet and exceed the standards in science, in this subgroup, we can see that our black students are definitely our lowest performing group. They're staying right around 87% that meet or exceed the standard, which is still really good. But compared to our white students, our Hispanic students, our multiracial students, they are our lowest performing ethnic group. We also might want to be a little concerned, or at least be aware of our Hispanic students that have dropped slightly over the last 3 years. They've gone from 93% to 91% down to 90%. So this is a small drop, but it's a slippery slope, so that's something that we don't want to just forget about. Okay, when we look at our subgroups and compared to all of our students, as we saw in the other chart, our students with disabilities are performing well below all the other students. And this is an area that we really might want to consider when we look at how we can improve our school overall and how we can improve our scores on the CRCTs in these areas. Because in science, you can see there is, on average, about a 30% difference in our students with disabilities compared to all of our other students. So this is something that we really might want to try to address. When we look at our areas of emphasis, things that we need to pay attention to and be aware of, the science CRCT scores have slightly reduced from the 2012-13 year to the 2013-14 year. While we're still up in the high 80% range that are meeting or exceeding, this is still the lowest overall category for the school. So science might be an area that we need to focus more on and try to see how we can address the issues. On the science CRCT, the Hispanic student scores have slightly decreased each year. It's been really slight. It hasn't been a lot, but it's still something that we want to keep an eye on and make sure that it's not a trend that continues. Our scores for black students have remained around 87% that are meeting or exceeding proficiency, which is still solid scores, but it makes them the lowest ethnic group that in our school is comparing their scores. So it's almost kind of getting stagnant, so we might want to see if there's things we can do to try to increase scores from our black students. The big thing, the achievement gap that exists between our students with disabilities subgroup, on the chart you saw that over the last 3 years, students with disabilities have averaged 32% lower on the science CRCT than all other students. So this is definitely an area that we need to look at and see if there's things we can do to try to close the achievement gaps. When we look at the scores, 50% of the students with disabilities did not meet proficiency on the science CRCT in 2013-14. And that is a big jump from the previous year, which only 38.4% didn't meet. So we jumped up from 38% to 50%. So we definitely need to look into that area and see what we can do. So our overall things that we can hopefully take from this and to consider, what can we do to close the achievement gaps for our subgroup? So are there things that we can do? Are there practices, teaching methods? So we need to focus on what we can do to try to close those gaps. What can we do to increase our students that are meeting or exceeding the standard? Overall, the school is doing very well, but how can we get more of the students that are meeting the standard to jump up to exceeding the standard? And those students that we have that are not meeting, what can we do to get them up to meeting the standard? Something else we need to consider, what can we do about our stagnant scores? You know, in those certain areas where the scores have kind of just settled in and become stagnant, are there things that we can do to try to improve in those areas? And then I think we need to look at what we know that's working for us, especially in areas that have continued to improve. What should we change? Are there things in our practice? Are there things in the content that we need to change to try to help our students? Is there professional development or other things that we need to consider? So all of these are things for us to keep in mind as we go into next year to try to improve our scores on the CRCT. So I hope you found this helpful, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.